So my prediction is come July or August of 2013, when the Iranians essentially hit the Israeli red line, Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to initiate military strikes against Iran. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has calculated that he is not willing to risk a potential rupture in U.S.-Israel relations by launching unilateral strikes against Iran. I don't agree with that necessarily, but that's my prediction. I think that before the end of President Obama's term, that the United States will launch military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, Iranian Revolutionary Guard bases, and it will be a massive aerial campaign combined with special forces, hunting down covert uranium enrichment facilities. Now, I caution you, we are in LSD land. This is potentially a fanciful scenario. There are perhaps more plausible scenarios, as Bret and Conrad have outlined. It is entirely possible that this administration decides to reach what will be seen by many as a stupid deal with the Iranians, where they provide the Iranians with, in exchange for giving up 20% of their enriched uranium and temporarily closing Fordo, that they give the Iranians the right to domestic enrichment, and that the Iranians retain that ability to break out or sneak out when they believe the will of the international community has eroded. It is plausible that the Iranian economy collapses, and that the collapse of the Iranian economy occurs before the Iranian nuclear red line. It is plausible that the collapse of the Iranian economy precipitates or reignites a democratic counter-revolution like we saw in June of 2009. It is plausible that that revolution is no longer a revolution of the Greens, but it's a revolution of the Blues. It's a revolution of people who are workers, who are lower middle class, who may have some ideological affinity with the regime, but are sick and tired of an economy that is crumbling, a standard of living that is dramatically eroding, and combined with the Greens, with the middle class, with the North Tehran intellectuals to decide once and for all to confront this regime.
I'm just going to pop in. Your prediction is, I actually want to ask you about regime change. Long term, it seems to me the real security of the world lies in this regime changing or in the Iranians overthrowing their government. What do you see as the likelihood of that in the near or long future?
Well, in the long term, the Iranian regime can't survive. In 1917, it was perfectly predictable that the Bolshevik regime couldn't possibly survive, given the economic program it espoused and given the reign of terror it proposed on its own people. The tragedy of the 20th century is that it took all the way until 1991 for the logic of Soviet communism to play itself out. The North Korean regime can't survive, and according to ordinary economic logic, should have collapsed sometime in the early 1990s when it lost its Soviet patron. And yet, there we are with Kim Jong-un. How is Castro surviving? So the question is not whether it's going to fall. It will fall. The question is when, how soon, how can we accelerate the process? And you know, for all of my making fun of Mark, which is much more vicious when we're just hanging out, I'll repeat that I think that sanctions are part of a package of actions that we need to pursue vis-a-vis Iran. My own view is that the most powerful point that you made in defense of sanctions is that it helps keep the Obama administration honest. Sanctions are more effective with Obama than they are with Khamenei. It's not a bad thing. We need to pursue, in a muscular way, a regime change strategy by support of the Green Revolution. But we cannot tremble in fear at the idea of some kind of military action against Iran. And the sooner it's undertaken, the better. One final point that I want to make, and I think this is one that I want to make not just sort of as a foreign policy analyst, but I want to make it as a Jew. And that's that we are not, or ought not to be, in the business of making sure that all of our actions can be justified in light of history or current circumstances. We are in the business of making sure that we, as Jews, and that the state of Israel will survive for generations. And it's really actually, to go back to the earlier discussion about Hamas, it's really, Israel can't be on a perpetual moral trial as to whether each and every one of its actions meets some test. Did the Israeli Air Force bomb the White House? Maybe it didn't. Maybe it killed this stupid poor family. I feel very sorry for them. All right? But, you know, if you know anything about the firebombing of Hamburg, it allows you to a certain sense of moral proportion in terms of what nations have done to assure their survival. Okay? Nothing Israel has ever done will come close to what Winston Churchill, the greatest prime minister England has ever had, did over the skies of Hamburg in 1943. So that's something that needs to be borne in mind. I don't know. Look, you know, Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, said prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. No, because actually, the statement is quite profound. It's not idiotic. The truth is, the past can often be very difficult to predict. Think about that. Go home and think about it. All right. So I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I have a sense of what we ought to do and how we ought to approach what it is we do. And it is not for us to be able to say to the editorial page of, let us say, the New York Times, that we had taken every risk for peace and gone every last inch on the road of diplomacy before we decided that we'd rather save ourselves than justify ourselves.
Mr. Black, you get the last word, your prediction. In the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, Paul Kennedy argues that the strength of a great power correlates strongly to economic durability. In other words, when a country's military ambitions outstrip its economic vitality, it declines. So I'm going to ask you to speculate, given the enormity of the American fiscal crisis, what lies ahead for America in terms of its ability and its desire to influence global politics and to try to make sure that Western values can be exported either implicitly or explicitly.
Paul Kennedy's book was in fact written about the United States, but shortly after it was published, it was the Soviet Union that demonstrated his case and collapsed, whereupon he said it was really written about the Soviet Union. Bret made very interesting points, saying that it was not Neville Chamberlain but Clement Attlee that made a more apt comparison and referred to the British withdrawal from empire. And of course he was right, they withdrew from the British Indian Empire, which is now 6 countries, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, and from Greece, and handed the Greek Civil War over to the United States, as well as from Palestine, as it was, and from Egypt. And it is a traditional sign of the weakening of a country when it translates military strength into social welfare. In fairness to Great Britain, it could not carry on the sort of empire it had for other reasons as well, and in particular the refusal of the governed countries to continue to be colonially governed. It was a remarkable achievement. They governed the British Indian Empire, 400 million people, and never had more than 100,000 British people in that empire. And they were not all military by any means. But on the prediction, on Paul Kennedy's thing and how it applies to the United States. Now, the fact is, I am not an optimist about this administration. I see no evidence whatever that they're going to take serious measures to reduce these deficits. And as a country, we don't want to get into economics too much, but it is a country that when Obama was inaugurated had an M2 money supply of $900 billion. And it runs these deficits of 1.5 trillion every year. And the majority of the deficit is not really sold at arm's length to buyers of American Treasury instruments. The majority is sold to a 100% subsidiary of the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, which pays for them by clicking across, like any of us exchanging emails, notes that it invents for the purpose. It's a shell game and it's a fraud. And one of the reasons that George Washington urged the setting up of the country, both as commander of the Continental Army and as convener of the Constitutional Convention and as president, was to have a reliable currency and a strong treasury. And that is, in fact, at issue. So it does raise serious questions about the fiscal integrity of the United States. The fact is it could deal with this problem relatively easily. And some people, including some combination of aspects of Simpson-Bowles and the Paul Ryan plan, would address a lot of it. But it does involve very comprehensive, very difficult matters that would require both parties to support and strong leadership. I don't see much sign of that in these next 4 years, but it doesn't mean it can't happen, and it certainly doesn't mean it couldn't happen after that, though it becomes more difficult. But essentially, you have to raise taxes on voluntary expenses to reduce the deficit and lower taxes on personal and business incomes to actually get a serious recovery. And you have to engage in entitlement reform, and you have to try by a variety of incentivizing means to reorient the economy away from instant gratification and total consumption to more investment and more added value. There are just too many people in the United States who are talented and work hard but don't contribute value, starting with the legal profession that takes 10% of GDP. But the United States is not, while it is in some respects in decline, it is not a country in free fall. It is an incomparably powerful country. All these representations that China is about to surpass it as a power in the world are absolutely rubbish. China still has 600 million people who live the way they did 3,000 years ago. It's a remarkable example of a developing country bootstrapping itself forward and upward. But to take the leadership of the world, not in our time, even the youngest person in the room. And my prediction is that the United States, because it only involved itself in the world when its leadership, led by President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, realized that if it did not become engaged in Europe and the Far East, hostile forces would develop in those areas, overturn the local balance of power, and threaten the United States in its hemisphere. And the great strategic team that Roosevelt assembled and succeeded him in subsequent administrations, Truman, Marshall, Atchison, Kennan, Bolin, and so forth, Eisenhower, they adopted that plan. The containment strategy worked. Europe is not now under threat. Russia's in no position to threaten it. The countries that ring China from India to Japan are perfectly capable of organizing, to the extent it's necessary, a regional balance. Relatively little involvement is required from the U.S. So I think some retrenchment by the United States is justified and not dangerous, and therefore and not absolutely forced upon it by its circumstances, and therefore not comparable with the breakup of the British Empire, which is an altogether different proposition. The power of the United States was never based on subjugation or colonial occupation. Occupying a continent that was underpopulated and treating the natives a bit roughly, yes, but that's quite different from going all over the world and setting up your flag over foreign peoples, which they've never done. So my prediction is that I don't expect much from this administration, but I think in general there will be an orderly retreat. The greatest retreat as long as it's justified retreat. There's no need for 300,000 American soldiers in Europe now as there were at the height of the Cold War, and that's why most of them have gone, and the world hasn't suffered from that, and neither has Europe. The greatest problem, as I think we've all said, is that this, and here I must agree entirely with Bret, and not to disagree with Mark in this case, despite my reservations about his pusillanimity in certain aspects. It is this absolutely inexplicable reluctance to do the obvious to prevent a terrible problem arising by Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And if you ask for a prediction on that, I suspect what will happen is Obama will pass, Netanyahu will do it, but the Americans will intervene to prevent the professional Israeli haters, stirred up in this case by the Russians and the Chinese, despite the famous reset and the famous pivot, will intervene with America's traditional allies, none stronger in this case than Canada, to ensure the